What's up, guys? This is TheKephas. In this video, I am going to showcase some new macros that I have created for World of Warcraft using a mod called Gnome Sequencer Enhanced. This mod allows you to create extremely powerful macros that can perform most, if not all, of your rotation with a single button. This can be extremely useful for individuals like myself who has a disability, or for people who just want to be lazy. So keep in mind that these macros are created primarily for those who are playing the game at a more casual level, but feel free to use them and alter them as you see fit. If you have further questions about the mod or my macros, I recommend checking out my FAQ video, and if you'd like to learn more about how to play the class in question, you might want to check out my crash course. It can help get you started, and I will provide links to all of these things in the description below. Today I'm going to show you the macros that I've created for Arms Warriors. Now, Arms Warriors were a lot of fun to macro for surprisingly relatively easy rotation, but definitely a little bit more of a challenge to macro, just because of just different, focus spending abilities, different phases, and so it's resulted in me feeling like the best thing to do is to make 3 separate macros for Arms Warriors, which is probably the most I've made for one class. Most classes these days can get by with 1 macro, some 2, but 3 for Arms Warriors. So we'll get into this and I'll explain why I've chosen to do 3 separate macros. So the 3 macros are going to be Arms A for AoE, Arms E for execute phase, and then Arms S for single target. Most of these are similar. I mean, they're pretty much all similar with a few changes. So let's go ahead and look at the single target one first and we'll get into it. So first things first, you will see that if you hold down shift, the macro will cast Rend. That's if you choose Rend as a talent. Rend is a bleed effect, a temporary dot. You don't want to be casting it all the time, but you want to do it enough just to keep the bleed effect up, so you can hold down shift to do that if you choose Rend as a talent. If not, you don't even have to worry about it. The macro is not even going to focus on it. So then we get into the main part of the macro. Of course, Colossus Smash, Overpower, and then Mortal Strike. These are your, bread and butter abilities. They're all right there, ready to go. And then, of course, if you choose Skull Splitter as a talent, the macro will use that. And then we've got @player Bladestorm. There's a reason for @player being put in there with Bladestorm. Macro will use Bladestorm normally, but we'll get into why there's an @player there later, @player, when we get into the talents portion. Okay, so speaking of which, we get it down to the bottom one here, and so you can see that if you choose Fervor of Battle, which would basically replace Slam with Whirlwind, the macro is going to be casting Whirlwind. If you don't choose Fervor of Battle, you choose the other two, the macro will cast Slam. Okay, that's basically how that's going to work, and that's why you see 2 Slams and a Whirlwind in there. It all depends on which talent you choose in row 3. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Otherwise, the macro is simply going to be prioritizing these abilities. I went ahead and put Overpower and Mortal Strike up early just to try to make sure that those are getting used as much as possible. Bladestorm's a little bit lower, but it should still be going off pretty much whenever you use Colossus Smash. Cool thing is that those cooldowns line up pretty well, even though Colossus Smash's cooldown is like, at least for me, it's like half of the cooldown of Bladestorm, which means that every other Colossus Smash, the macro should use Bladestorm. That's generally how it's going to work for the most part. Okay, now of course, the macro is going to be using Slam a lot to dump excess rage. And so if you feel like you're not having enough rage for Mortal Strike or whatever, or maybe it's like it's dumping too much rage, then, and this would probably change up significantly how the macros all work. You could always remove the filler rage spenders that are in the macro entirely and use those on separate buttons, because the big difference between all 3 of these macros is going to be the rage spenders. I designed these macros to be as simple as possible to make the game easier for people to play, but if you want to have more control over your filler rage spenders, then you could really probably, in that case, you could do probably 1 macro and then just have you know, everything except for those like Whirlwind, Slam, and then Execute, which we'll get into. You can take those out and then just have one macro and then use those abilities on separate buttons. So that's something else that you can do, but this is just, you know, something that I feel like is a little bit easier. So anyway, we get down to the bottom line. The macro is going to use Victory Rush whenever it can, whenever it's available, and then it's going to use Avatar or Deadly Calm if you choose either one of those as talents. They work out really well down there. They're off the global cooldown. They just, you know, you just use them on cooldown and you'll get your buffs. So that's the single target one. Now let's go ahead and look at the let's go ahead and look at the AoE one next. Okay, so this is for whenever you're fighting multiple enemies, and now you're going to be using Whirlwind no matter what. So you can see there's no, like, you know, Slam, Whirlwind. You don't even have to take into account Fervor of Battle. That's not important now. But there is another portion. Again, it's pretty much the exact same thing. There is the inclusion of Sweeping Strikes, and then Colossus Smash, Overpower, they're in there. And then we get down into this. If you choose Cleave, the macro is going to be using Cleave instead of Mortal Strike, because in AoE situations, Cleave would replace Mortal Strike because it does benefit from everything that Mortal Strike benefits from. It also causes deep wounds. So you don't want to use Cleave, obviously, when you're fighting one target, but if you choose it, you're fighting multiple targets, you would switch to using Cleave rather than Mortal Strike. So that's the idea here. If you don't choose Cleave as a talent, honestly, I don't know why Cleave isn't just in the I mean, it's such a helpful talent. I don't know why it's not just in the base game. That's why I mentioned it in my rotation guide, because it's such a helpful talent. But anyway, if you don't choose Cleave as a talent, then obviously you're going to be using Mortal Strike on your primary target, and you'll benefit a little bit from Sweeping Strikes. But anyways, yeah, so there you go. And then, of course, again, Skull Splitter, Blade Storm, Whirlwind, pretty standard stuff. It's all pretty much the same. It just changes up the Cleave thing and then just uses Whirlwind full time. And then lastly, we've got the Execute Phase 1, and you can probably guess what this is going to be. Exact same thing as the other two macros pretty much, except now you're going to be spending your Rage on Execute. Now again, and this goes into all these macros, it's a matter of spending your Rage. You know, Execute is one of those things where it's a little bit more complex because it can use as little as 20 or as much as 40 Rage. So obviously, whenever you have enough Rage and whenever the macro reaches Execute in the, you know, in the priority, it's going to be using Execute. It's not going to consider how much Rage it's using. It's simply going to use it. So if you don't like that, if you want more control over how much Rage Execute uses, you want to use it only at 40 or whatever, then this is probably not going to be the best option for you. But if you're looking for an easier time, then this will simply work. It's going to use it. It's going to use up your Rage. But again, another option entirely, if you don't like how these macros are using your Rage, is simply to make one macro. Basically, you would make a macro just like this one here, take Execute out of the macro, and then, you know, just use this one, and then just use Execute, Whirlwind, and Slam on separate buttons. That'll give you much more control over your Rage. You can dump it on those abilities. Something just to keep in mind. It's entirely up to you how you do it, but there you go, you guys. Feel free to test these out and, you know, and all that kind of stuff and see what works best for you. But there are a couple of talents, of course, we should probably go over here. Let's go ahead and look at them. A big part of why we have 3 separate macros is because of how some of these talents work and trying to make the best, you know, situation to give you the options for any of your talents is kind of the idea here. Okay, so we've got Sudden Death. This is probably the first one we need to go over. This would just give you a free Execute. You can use it anytime. Spends automatically. It'll work as if you spent 40 Rage. If this procs, just use your Execute macro. The macro will use Execute whenever it gets to it in a priority. Pretty straightforward. You just switch from using the single target one or the AoE one to using the Execute one or whatever. Okay, so of course we've already gone over the Fervor of Battle thing, so we don't need to go over that. Same with Cleave, you know how that works. However, if you choose Warbreaker, it simply replaces Colossus Smash, which means that the macro is going to use Warbreaker as if it were going to use Colossus Smash. So you don't have to worry about changing anything there. That also would apply to Impending Victory as well. It's going to work the same way. So just keep that in mind. Again, we already said Avatar, Deadly Calm, those are going to be, you know, used on cooldown, regardless of which one you use. Of course, if you do go with Dreadnought and then Overpower has 2 charges, it's simply going to use however many charges it has. If it's available, the macro is going to use it. And then we get into Ravager, and this one is a replacement of Blade Storm. Again, same thing. A lot of these are just replacers, which is kind of nice. It works really well in the macro. You will get a reduced cooldown for Blade Storm. Obviously, it will get a Ravager has a 45-second cooldown. But the cool thing is I've gone ahead and I've put an @player line on Blade Storm so that if you switch over to Ravager with this talent, Ravager is a target location ability, which means that it's a green reticle. You click the button, a green reticle pops up. In this instance, the way I have it set up is that it will place Ravager at your feet, and it's going to spin around right where you're standing, and since you're a melee fighter anyways, it's going to be dealing the damage to all the enemies that are near you. So just keep that in mind. Make sure that you are in melee range when you start spamming if you do choose to go with this talent, but it will work out pretty well. It will use it on cooldown. It's also going to generate you some extra rage, so that's always nice as well. So keep that in mind. It's a really good, really easy to use talent. All these are really nice depending on what situation you're in. If you want something just simpler, then you obviously don't have to go with Ravager, but the macro will manage Ravager. That's kind of the point. So I hope that made sense. But otherwise, you guys, let me know what you think about these macros, all 3 of them, in the comments below. Let me know what you decided to work with, and let me know what you think about it in the comments below, and I will see you guys on the next one. And that's basically everything you need to know about these macros and how they work. Remember, these macros work best when they are spammed, so either press the button as fast as you can or use a rapid fire button, which is fair game as long as you're the one pressing the button. As powerful as these macros are, they are far from perfect. So if you want to play the game at a high level and get the most out of your class, I highly recommend that you play the game without these macros. But if you'd like to get started with Gnome Sequencer Enhanced, you can do so by downloading and installing the mod. A link can be found in the description below. Along with it, you will find paste bin links for any macros featured in this video. If you'd like to use them, simply click the link and you'll be taken to a raw paste bin of the macro. Select the entire macro, copy, log into the appropriate class, type /GS to open the Gnome Sequencer screen, click on Import, paste the macro into the available space, make sure that Automatically Create Macro Icon is checked, and click Import. You can now drag the icon to your action bar and the macro is ready to be used. If you followed all the steps correctly, the macro should be working fine. If something isn't working, start over and make sure that you follow all the steps correctly. If you are having further issues, I recommend that you check out the mod page or contact the mod's author for more information. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, let me know by clicking that like button. And feel free to share it with your friends so they can enjoy it as well. And if you'd like to see more videos, you can subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to be notified as soon as new videos are posted. You can also follow me on Facebook, and if you'd like, you can support my work on Patreon. Links to all that stuff can be found in the description below. This is TheKephas. Until next time.